She boarded that ship as a prisoner. She left it as a duchess. And it only took one storm to change everything. Picture this. A harbour at dawn. The creak of rigging in the half-light. The smell of salt and tar and wet rope. Gulls wheeling against a sky the colour of pewter. And on the deck of a merchant vessel called the Gloriana, a young woman with dark hair and bruised wrists standing at the rail, watching England shrink into the fog. She was not a passenger. She had no cabin. She had no ticket, no trunk, no invitation. She was cargo, listed nowhere on the manifest, mentioned in no letter, expected by no one at any port. Her father had brought her aboard the way he brought aboard barrels of Madeira wine and bolts of Indian silk, because she was his, and he could do with his property as he pleased. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I love hearing from all corners of the world. Drop your city and your local time below. Whether it is morning coffee in Manila or a late night in Manchester, I want to know who is here. Tonight's story is set in 1843. It is the story of a young woman named Delphine Marchetti, half English, half Italian, raised on merchant ships and in foreign ports, who has never had a home that was not made of wood and seawater. And it is the story of a man named Wolfe Sterndale, the Duke of Kenmore, who has not left his cliff-top estate in 4 years, who speaks to almost no one, and who has been quietly, methodically, obsessively searching for a woman he met once, for 3 minutes, at a harbour in Plymouth. She does not know he has been looking. She does not know his name. She does not even know he exists, but he knows her. He has always known her. And when the storm drives the Gloriana onto the rocks below Kenmore Hall, and she crawls from the wreckage onto his shore, everything changes. Let me take you back to the Devon coast in the autumn of 1843, where the waves crash against the cliffs like fists against a locked door, and where Delphine Marchetti is about to discover that drowning is not the worst thing that can happen to a woman on her father's ship. The Gloriana had been Captain Absalom Marchetti's kingdom for 22 years. She was a 3-masted bark, 240 tons, built in the yards at Bristol and refitted twice since. Her hull was black. Her sails were patched. Her figurehead, a woman with outstretched arms and blank wooden eyes, had lost 3 fingers to rot and weather. Now it is important to understand what a merchant captain was in 1843 England. He was not the romantic figure of penny novels, the dashing privateer with a sword and a smile. A merchant captain was a businessman. He purchased goods in one port and sold them in another, and the difference between those 2 prices was his life. His crew answered to him absolutely. His ship was his property, and his family, should they be foolish enough to sail with him, existed at his pleasure. Absalom Marchetti had married an Italian woman, Maria Conti, the daughter of a Genoese wine merchant, in 1820, when he was 31 and she was 19. Maria had been beautiful, gentle, and entirely unsuited to life on a merchant vessel. She had given him 1 child, a daughter, and had died of fever in a Lisbon boarding house when the child was 3. Absalom had never remarried. He had never forgiven his daughter for surviving when her mother did not. Delphine understood this with the particular clarity of a child who has spent her entire life reading the weather of a violent man's face the way other children read storybooks. She knew the angle of his jaw that meant silence was required. She knew the set of his shoulders that meant she should be nowhere near the quarterdeck. She knew the particular quality of stillness that preceded a blow. That terrible, taut pause like a rope drawn so tight it sang. She was 21 years old. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders when unbound, though she kept it braided and pinned beneath a cap aboard ship. Her eyes were the colour of honey held up to lamplight. Her mother's eyes, Absalom had told her once, which was the cruelest thing he had ever said, because it meant he saw Maria every time he looked at her, and hated her for it. She could navigate by the stars. She could splice rope and reef a sail and calculate tonnage and read a ledger. She spoke English, Italian, and enough Portuguese to haggle in a market. She could cook for 14 men with whatever stores remained in the hold. She could sew canvas and mend nets and keep accounts that would satisfy the most suspicious customs officer. None of this mattered to her father. What mattered to her father was that she was female, that she reminded him of a dead woman, and that she was useful enough to keep, but not important enough to educate, to clothe properly, or to protect. She slept in the storage compartment below the forecastle, in a hammock strung between two beams, with the rats and the provisions and the bilge water sloshing beneath the planking. She ate what was left after the crew had taken their shares. She wore clothes that had been mended so many times they were more thread than fabric. A cotton dress that had once been blue and was now the colour of nothing. A shawl that had belonged to her mother, a pair of boots, 2 sizes too large that she stuffed with rags to keep them on her feet. Now it is worth pausing here to understand what it meant, in 1843, to be a woman with no documentation. England was a country built on paper. Birth was recorded in the parish register. Baptism was recorded by the church. Marriage required a license. Death required a certificate. A person who existed in none of these documents was, in the eyes of the law, not a person at all. They could not inherit. They could not testify in court. They could not marry without first proving they existed. Delphine Marchetti, born on a ship, baptized nowhere, educated by no institution, employed by no master, was a ghost. She walked and breathed and thought and felt, and none of it counted, because no clerk had ever written her name in any book. She had never been to school. She had never attended a dance or a dinner party or a church service on dry land. She had never owned a book, though she had read every one she could steal from the ports they visited, devouring them in the dim light of the storage compartment, with her knees drawn up and her heart pounding with the fear of being caught. And she had never, not once in her life, been touched with kindness by a man. Now I want to pause here and tell you about the man who was, at this very moment, standing on a cliff 40 miles up the Devon coast, watching the same sea that Delphine watched, though from an entirely different vantage. Wolfe Sterndale, the 7th Duke of Kenmore, was 33 years old. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that had been built by years of hauling lines aboard a naval frigate rather than by any gentleman's exercise. His hair was dark, nearly black, and he wore it longer than was fashionable, which was not a statement of rebellion, but of indifference. His eyes were a pale, startling grey, the colour of sea fog, the colour of steel before it catches the light, and they looked at the world with an expression that most people found deeply unsettling. He did not smile. He did not make conversation. He did not attend balls or dinners or shooting parties. He did not reply to invitations. He did not receive callers. He lived alone in Kenmore Hall, a great grey, wind-battered house on the edge of the Devon cliffs, with a staff of 11, a library of 4,000 volumes, and a silence so complete that the housekeeper sometimes pressed her ear to his study door, simply to confirm he was still breathing. He had been a naval officer. He had served with distinction in actions along the coast of West Africa and in the Mediterranean. He had commanded a sloop of war at 26. He had been mentioned in dispatches twice. He had taken a musket ball in the left shoulder at the Battle of Navarino and carried the scar like a second skeleton beneath his shirt. And then his father had died, and his older brother had died 3 months later of typhus, and Wolfe Sterndale, who had wanted nothing from life except the sea and the silence of deep water, had become the Duke of Kenmore and had been dragged back to a world he did not want, and handed a title he had never expected. He had tried. For 1 year he had tried. He had gone to London. He had attended Parliament. He had sat through dinners where people spoke about nothing, as though nothing were the most important subject in the world. He had endured the marriage market, the circling mothers, the simpering daughters, the endless calculations of dowry and bloodline and acreage, as though love were a shipping contract and a woman were freight. He had hated every moment. And then 4 years ago he had stopped. He had retreated to Kenmore Hall. He had dismissed the London staff. He had locked the townhouse. He had written to his solicitor with instructions that all business be conducted by letter and that no visitor was to be admitted to the estate without prior written permission. Society called him a recluse, a hermit, mad. His aunt, Lady Floris Sterndale, the dowager countess of somewhere or other, had written to him every month for 4 years, each letter more desperate than the last, begging him to return to civilization, to find a wife, to produce an heir. He read her letters. He did not answer them. But there was one thing that society did not know, that no one knew except Wolfe himself and the man he employed to conduct the search. 4 years ago, in the harbour at Plymouth, on the last day Wolfe had spent in any public place, he had seen a girl. She was on the deck of a merchant ship. She was scrubbing the planking on her hands and knees. Her dress was threadbare, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a bruise on her cheekbone the colour of a storm cloud. She was perhaps 17, and she had looked up. That was all. She had looked up from the deck, squinting against the sun, and their eyes had met across the 20 feet of harbour water that separated his gangway from her ship. 3 minutes, perhaps less. She had looked at him with those extraordinary amber eyes, not with deference, not with fear, not with the calculated appraisal he had come to expect from every woman in England, but with something else entirely. Something raw and direct and almost startled, as though she had recognized him, though they had never met. Then a voice had shouted from below deck, harsh, commanding, furious, and she had flinched as though struck and dropped her gaze and gone back to scrubbing. Wolfe had stood on that gangway for 7 minutes after she disappeared. He knew because he had counted. He had gone home that night. He had locked his estate. And the next morning, he had begun to search. His man was called Sefton Birch, a former clerk to a shipping firm, now employed exclusively by the Duke of Kenmore at a salary that exceeded what most barristers earned. Birch was thin, methodical, spectacled, and tireless. He had spent 4 years tracking the movements of the merchant vessel Gloriana, its ports of call, its cargo manifests, its crew lists, its owner's debts and dealings and disputes. He knew that the ship belonged to one Captain Absalom Marchetti. He knew that Marchetti was widowed, that he had a daughter, that the daughter had no legal existence, no baptismal record they could find, no school enrollment, no record of employment or apprenticeship or parish registration. She existed only on the ship. She appeared in no official document anywhere in England. Birch had reported all of this to the Duke. He had also reported that Marchetti owed money to half the merchants in Bristol, that he drank heavily when in port, that he had struck a customs officer in Falmouth and been fined rather than imprisoned, only because no magistrate wanted the trouble of storing his crew, and that the daughter, whose name Birch had finally obtained from a Lisbon dock worker who remembered a dark-haired girl buying bread, was called Delphine. Delphine. The Duke had written the name in a leather notebook and kept the notebook in the drawer of his desk. He had not spoken the name aloud. Not once. He was not, he told himself, obsessed. He was concerned. He had seen a young woman in obvious distress under the power of a man who was clearly violent, with no legal protections and no means of escape. He was doing what any decent man would do. This was a lie, and Wolfe knew it was a lie, and he told it to himself every morning when he opened the desk drawer and looked at the notebook. If he had been merely concerned, he would have reported the matter to the authorities. He would have contacted a charity. He would have spoken to a clergyman. He had not done any of these things. He had instead spent 4 years and considerable fortune building a room in the east wing of Kenmore Hall that contained a detailed chart of every port the Gloriana had visited since 1839, with dates and durations marked in red ink. Copies of every cargo manifest Birch had been able to obtain. A list of every crew member who had served aboard her. A painted miniature, commissioned from an artist Birch had hired to observe the Plymouth docks, of a young woman with dark hair and amber eyes, kneeling on a ship's deck with the sunlight behind her. The miniature was not good. The artist had worked from memory, and a description. The proportions were slightly wrong, the expression too placid, the eyes not quite the right shade. Wolfe kept it on his desk anyway. Now, I want to be honest with you, and I think this is something worth sitting with for a moment. What Wolfe Sterndale was doing was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. And I do not mean that entirely as a compliment. There is a line between devotion and obsession, between care and control, and Wolfe had crossed it so gradually that he had not noticed the crossing. He told himself he was trying to help her. But the room in the east wing, with its charts and its manifest copies and its painted miniature, was not the room of a man who wanted to help a stranger. It was the room of a man who had decided in the space of 3 minutes on a Plymouth dock that a woman he had never spoken to was his, and who had spent 4 years quietly, patiently, relentlessly building the machinery of claiming her, whether this was love or something else. That is for you to decide, my friends. Keep listening. The storm came on the 14th of October, 1843. It came from the southwest, which was unusual for that time of year, and it came fast. Faster than the barometer had predicted, faster than any of the coastal watchers had expected. By noon, the sky over the English Channel was the colour of bruised fruit. By 2 o'clock, the sea had risen to swells of 30 feet. By 4 o'clock, in the last grey light of the day, the wind was blowing at gale force, and every ship within 50 miles of the Devon coast was running for shelter. The Gloriana was not among them. Captain Marchetti, who prided himself on never running from weather, had ordered the sails shortened, but had refused to change course. They were carrying a cargo of Spanish wine and Portuguese cork, bound for Bristol, and every day of delay cost money. Marchetti would no more divert for a storm than he would divert for a funeral. Delphine knew they were going to wreck. She knew it the way she knew everything about the sea, not from education, but from 21 years of reading waves and wind and the terrible mathematics of wood against water. The Gloriana was old. Her hull had been patched twice, her rigging was frayed, and the captain was drunk. She said nothing. She had learned many years ago that saying something was worse than saying nothing. She went below and secured the provisions. She checked the pumps. She moved anything breakable or valuable to the lowest point in the hold. And then she went to the first mate. Mr. Collis Fane was the only man aboard the Gloriana whom Delphine did not actively fear. He was 40, broad-faced, weather-beaten, with hands like dock bollards and a voice that carried across a gale without rising. He had sailed with Marchetti for 9 years. He did not approve of how the captain treated his daughter. He had never said so. But he had, on 3 separate occasions, positioned himself between Delphine and her father when Absalom's drinking had reached the stage where his fists began to clench. Delphine found him on the lower deck, checking the cargo lashings. "Mr. Fane." He looked up. His face told her he already knew. "We cannot make Bristol in this," she said. "The hull will not hold." "I know. Will you speak to him?" Fane's jaw tightened. "I spoke to him an hour ago. He told me to mind my own vessel or find myself one." Delphine closed her eyes. Behind her lids she saw the Plymouth harbour, the sunlight, the man on the gangway. She did not know why she thought of him now. She had thought of him many times in 4 years, though she had never admitted this to anyone, least of all herself. But the memory came, unbidden and vivid, like a candle lit in a dark room. Grey eyes, very steady. Looking at her as though she were not nothing, she opened her eyes. "Then I will go to the boats." "He has locked the boats." Of course he had, because Absalom Marchetti would rather sink with his cargo than let a single soul aboard his ship make a decision without his permission. She tried anyway. She went above deck into the shrieking wind and made her way to the launch. The davits were chained. She pulled at the iron links with her bare hands until her fingers bled and the metal would not give. She turned to go back below Affetable to find a crowbar, a hammer, anything. And her father was there. He was standing at the top of the companionway. The wind whipped his coat. His face was purple with drink and rage and the particular fury of a man who knows he is wrong and will punish anyone who proves it. "Where are you going?" "The boats." His hand caught her arm, not the gentle positioning of a man steering a woman through a doorway, the grip of a man seizing cargo that was about to go overboard. "You do not touch my boats. You do not touch my ship. You do not make decisions on my vessel." "Father, we are going to be the back of his hand connected with her cheekbone, the same cheekbone, always the same cheekbone. She staggered, the wind caught her, and she nearly went over the rail, and for one terrible tilting moment the sea was below her, black and boiling and infinite. And she thought, "This is how I die, not in the wreck, before it, thrown overboard by the man who was supposed to protect me." Fane appeared. He pulled her back from the rail. He said nothing to the captain. He never said anything to the captain. That was the terrible, cowardly bargain to his loyalty. But he put himself between them, and Marchetti, who had exhausted his rage for the moment, turned and lurched back toward the quarterdeck. "Get below," Fane said to Delphine. "The hold now." She went below, but when she reached the hold she heard the bolt slam home above her. Her father had locked the hatch. She was in the hold. The water was rising. The ship was dying. And the man who was supposed to be her father had locked her in a wooden coffin and gone back to his wheel. Now I want you to understand something about this moment, because it matters beyond the story. In 1843, the Board of Trade had begun to regulate merchant shipping, but enforcement was sporadic, and the rules were designed to protect cargo, not people. A captain's authority aboard his vessel was nearly absolute. He answered to his owners, if he had any, and to the law of the port once he arrived. But at sea, between ports, he was king and judge and jailer. There was no appeal. There was no witness. There was only the water and the wind, and whatever mercy, if any, lived inside the man who held the wheel. Absalom Marchetti had no mercy. He had spent it all long ago on a dead wife and a living daughter who reminded him of her. The water reached Delphine's ankles. Then her knees. The ship groaned, a deep structural sound, the sound of a spine breaking. And she knew she had minutes, perhaps less. She found the cargo hatch, not the locked companionway. The smaller hatch used for loading provisions barely wide enough for a flour barrel. She had squeezed through it before as a child, when her father had locked her in as punishment and she had learned the geography of her prison the way a rat learns a maze. She was no longer a child. She was 21, but she was thin. Her father's meals had seen to that, and desperate, and desperation makes the body flexible in ways that comfort never does. She pushed the hatch cover. It moved, not locked. The crew had been too busy with the storm. She squeezed through, scraping her ribs against the frame, the ribs that would break an hour later on the rocks. And she emerged on the lower deck, and the water was everywhere, and the ship was listing 30 degrees to port. And she knew with the absolute clarity of a woman who has spent her life reading the sea that she had perhaps 10 minutes before the Gloriana went down. She climbed, hand over hand, up the tilting companionway with the seawater dragging at her skirts and the ship shuddering beneath her like a horse that knows it is going down. Her fingers were numb, Her ribs screamed with every rung. The salt water burned the cuts on her palms, and she climbed anyway, because the alternative was the dark and the cold and the nothing, and Delphine Marchetti had decided. Somewhere between the locked hatch and the cargo opening, somewhere between her father's fist and Collis Fane's silence, that she was not going to die on this ship. The Gloriana struck the rocks at 6:07 in the evening. The sound was extraordinary, a scream of wood, an iron that seemed to come from the ship itself, as though the vessel were a living thing and knew it was dying. The impact threw Delphine against the bulkhead. She felt something crack in her left side, a rib, perhaps two. And then the water came. It came fast. It came cold. So cold that it stole the breath from her lungs and turned her muscles to stone. It came in sheets through the hull breach, pouring into the hold with a sound like a waterfall, and Delphine, who had lived on water her entire life, understood in that moment that the sea was not her home. The sea was indifferent. The sea did not care whether she lived or died. The sea would swallow her the way it swallowed everything. Completely, without conscience, without memory, she fought. She found the companionway ladder by feel, in the dark, in the rising water, with her broken ribs screaming and the ship groaning around her like an animal in its death throes. She climbed, the water followed. She reached the deck, and the wind hit her like a wall, a solid physical force that drove her to her knees and nearly over the rail. The Gloriana was breaking apart. She could feel it beneath her. The planking splitting, the keel twisting, the whole vast structure of the ship coming undone like a body surrendering to fever. Lightning split the sky, and in its flash she saw the rocks, great black teeth of granite rising from the foam, and beyond the rocks, impossibly close, impossibly high, a cliff face. And at the top of the cliff face, a light, a single light, burning in a window. She did not think. She did not calculate odds or consider alternatives or weigh the mathematics of survival. She simply jumped. The sea took her. It pulled her down and turned her and filled her mouth with salt and darkness. She fought, kicking, clawing, reaching for anything solid, and her hand found rock, granite, sharp and cold and real. She held on. The waves tried to tear her away. She held on. Her fingernails broke. She held on. And then somehow, she never knew how, she never remembered the details. The memory was a blur of cold and pain and animal desperation. She was out of the water. She was on the rocks, she was crawling, she was climbing. Her ribs were on fire, and her hands were bleeding, and the wind was trying to push her back into the sea. But she was climbing, and the light was above her, and she was climbing toward it. She reached the top of the cliff. She collapsed on the grass. She lay there, in the rain, in the wind, in the cold, with the taste of salt and blood in her mouth, and the last thing she saw before consciousness left her was a door opening. A great oak door, lit from behind by warm amber candlelight, and a man's silhouette filling the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, very still. She thought, grey eyes. And then she thought nothing at all. Wolf heard the wreck before he saw it. The sound carried through the storm, wood splintering on granite, the particular shriek of a vessel being torn apart, and he was on his feet and moving before his mind had fully processed what the sound meant. He had been in his study, he had been reading, he had not been looking at the desk. Draw. He took a lantern and went to the cliff path, the steep, narrow track that wound down the headland to the rocks below. His steward, Birch, was behind him, shouting something about danger and sense and the impossibility of reaching the rocks in this weather. Wolfe did not hear him. Wolfe was counting. The wreck sounds had been close, very close, which meant the ship had struck the reef directly below the hall. He reached the cliff edge. Lightning flashed, and he saw her. She was on the grass. She was soaking wet and barely conscious, and there was blood on her hands, and her dress was torn, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He knew her instantly, not from the miniature. The miniature was nothing like her. The miniature was a poor shadow of a thing that had no power to capture what she actually was. But from Plymouth, from the dock, from the 3 minutes 4 years ago that had rearranged the architecture of his entire existence. He dropped to his knees beside her. He put the lantern down. He touched her face, carefully, so carefully, as though she were made of something that might shatter. And she opened her eyes. Amber, like honey, like lamplight. "You," she whispered. And then she was gone again. She woke in a bed. This was, in itself, extraordinary. Delphine had slept in a hammock for as long as she could remember. The sensation of a mattress beneath her, feathers and horsehair and linen, soft and warm and impossibly still, was so foreign that for a moment she believed she had died, and this was whatever came after. Then her ribs reminded her that she was very much alive. She gasped. The pain was sharp and immediate, and it brought the world into focus. A high ceiling painted cream, heavy curtains drawn against grey light, a fire burning in a stone fireplace, a room larger than the entire cargo hold of the Gloriana, and sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching her, with those grey eyes, still steady, unchanged by 4 years and the width of the English Channel, the man from the dock. He was holding a cup of tea. He was not drinking it. He was simply holding it, as though he had forgotten it existed, as though there were only one thing in the room worth attending to, and it was not the tea. "You have 2 broken ribs," he said. His voice was low and quiet and very controlled, the voice of a man who had spent years learning not to reveal what he felt. "The physician has bound them. You also have lacerations on your hands and a gash on your left temple that required 3 stitches. You have been unconscious for approximately 14 hours. Delphine stared at him. "My name is Wolfe Sterndale," he said. "I am the Duke of Kenmore. You are in my house." "I know you," she said. Her voice came out as a rasp, salt-damaged, rough, barely above a whisper. "Plymouth. The dock." Something moved behind his eyes, something vast and controlled and dangerous, like a wave building far from shore. "Yes," he said. "You were watching me." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. The fire cracked in the grate. The wind moaned against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking. "I have no answer to that question," he said. "That would not alarm you." And despite everything, the pain, the cold, the wreck, the sea that had tried to swallow her, the 21 years of a father's indifference and cruelty, Delphine Marchetti laughed. It hurt. It hurt her ribs and her throat and her stitched temple. But she laughed because the honesty of it, the sheer undecorated truthfulness of a man admitting that he had no non-alarming explanation for why he had watched a girl scrub a deck from 20 feet away and remembered her for 4 years, was the most genuine thing anyone had ever said to her. "I appreciate the warning," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. The corners of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch and then stopped, as though the muscles had forgotten the mechanism. How do you feel? Like I was thrown into the sea and climbed a cliff. That is what happened. I know. Another silence. He still had not drunk the tea. The ship, she said, and the laughter was gone. The crew. Mr. Fane. She stopped. She did not say father. She had not called Absalom that in years. 4 men were recovered alive from the rocks this morning, Wolfe said, including the first mate. He is injured but will survive. And the captain? Wolfe's expression did not change. Captain Marchetti was recovered as well. He sustained a broken leg and is currently being attended to in the village. Something in her chest that was not her ribs tightened. He will come for me, she said. He will try, Wolfe said, and the way he said it, quiet, precise, absolutely final, made it clear that try was the operative word. But she had no idea what was waiting for her in this house. None at all. Now it is essential to understand the legal terrain that Delphine found herself navigating. In 1843, an unmarried woman was, in the eyes of English law, the property of her father until she married, at which point she became the property of her husband. This was not a metaphor. This was statute. A father could compel his daughter's residence, restrict her movements, control her earnings, and, critically, dictate her marriage. He could not legally beat her, though in practice the law turned a remarkably blind eye to what happened behind closed doors, and in Delphine's case, behind the hull of a merchant ship sailing in international waters. A duke, on the other hand, existed at the very apex of English legal and social power, below the royal family and above everyone else. His word carried the weight of precedent. His displeasure carried the weight of ruin. And when a duke decided to involve himself in a matter, any matter, no matter how small, the machinery of English society rearranged itself around his will like iron filings around a magnet. Captain Absalom Marchetti was about to discover what it felt like to be on the wrong side of that magnet. The first 3 days at Kenmore Hall were a revelation, not because of luxury, though the luxury was staggering. Clean sheets, hot water, food that was not hardtack or salt beef, a fire that burned all night, a door she could close, a room that did not pitch and roll with the waves. The revelation was silence, not the dead silence of a becalmed sea, which Delphine knew well and which had its own particular terror. This was a different kind of quiet, inhabited, warm, chosen. The silence of a house where no one was shouting, where no one was drunk, where no footsteps on the stairs meant violence approaching. She slept for most of the first day. On the second day, she woke to find that someone had laid out clothes for her on the chair. A dress of dark blue wool, simple but well made with pearl buttons and a lace collar, undergarments, a pair of leather boots that fit, a hairbrush. She held the hairbrush for a long time. It had a silver back engraved with wild flowers. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of crying years ago, because crying on a ship full of men was dangerous, because tears were a weakness Absalom punished, because she had decided at 13 that she would feel everything and show nothing. But she held the hairbrush, and her throat ached. The Duke did not visit her room again. Instead, he sent Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, a stout woman with iron grey hair and eyes that missed nothing, to attend to her needs. Mrs. Pell brought food. Mrs. Pell brought books. Mrs. Pell brought reports on the weather and the state of the wreck and the condition of the surviving crew members. Mrs. Pell did not bring reports on the Duke, but she did not need to. Delphine had eyes. She noticed that the fire in her room was always lit before she woke. She noticed that the books left on her bedside table were not random selections but specific choices. A volume of maritime history, a collection of Italian poetry, a guide to Devon wildflowers, as though someone had considered what a woman who had lived on ships and spoken Italian and never been allowed to read might want. She noticed that when she walked in the corridor, slowly, carefully, with her ribs protesting every step, the Duke's study door was always ajar, and that when she passed it, there was a quality of stillness from within that suggested someone was listening very carefully to the sound of her footsteps. On the third day, she stopped outside the study door. "You may come in," he said, before she knocked, "if you wish." She pushed the door open. The study was large and dark and lined with books from floor to ceiling. A fire burned in the grate. The desk was massive, oak, scarred, covered with papers, and there in the corner, mounted on an easel, was a painted miniature of a dark-haired woman kneeling on a ship's deck. Delphine walked toward it. She stood in front of it. She looked at it for a long time. "That is meant to be me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, it is not very good." "No," Wolfe agreed. "The artist worked from a description. He never saw you himself." "When was this painted?" 3 years ago." The air in the room changed. She could feel it. The way the temperature shifts before a storm. The way the barometer drops before anyone can see the clouds. Something enormous and unnamed was building between them, and she did not know whether it was dangerous or wonderful, or both. "You have been looking for me," she said. "For 4 years." "Yes." "Why?" He stood. He was so much taller than her. She barely reached his shoulder. And the proximity was overwhelming in a way she had not expected. He smelled of cedar and ink and something warm and clean, and he looked at her with those grey eyes, and she understood in that moment that he was afraid, not of her, of what he was about to say. "Because I have not been able to stop," he said. But Delphine Marchetti was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had spent 21 years in the company of a man who controlled everything. Her food, her sleep, her movements, her body, her silence. And she had learned that men who wanted to possess you did not always announce their intentions with fists. Sometimes they announced them with kindness, with gifts, with rooms full of charts and painted miniatures, and a silence that felt like warmth, but might be a cage. She stepped back from him. Not far, 1 step, but it was enough. "Your Grace, I am grateful for your hospitality. I would be dead without it. But I have spent my entire life belonging to a man who decided I was his property, and I cannot walk from one cage into another, no matter how comfortable the furnishings." The Duke did not move. He didn't argue. He did not flinch. "I would expect nothing less from you," he said quietly. "You are free to leave whenever you choose. There are funds set aside for your passage to any city in England. Mrs. Pell will arrange everything." He meant it. She could hear it in his voice. that careful, controlled restraint that was not coldness, but discipline. He was offering her the door, genuinely, completely, and that, more than the hairbrush, more than the books, more than 4 years of searching, was the thing that made her stay. Not because she was trapped, because she chose to. "I will stay," she said, "for now." "For now," he repeated. "I want to pause here and tell you about what happened next, because the next 2 weeks at Kenmore Hall were unlike anything Delphine had experienced, and I think they deserve to be understood on their own terms. Nothing happened. That is to say, everything happened, but none of it was dramatic. There was no declaration, no confrontation, no passionate embrace in the rain. There were only days, quiet, ordinary, extraordinary days, in which two people who had both spent their lives in different kinds of isolation began very carefully to learn what it felt like not to be alone. They walked on the cliffs. Her ribs were healing, and the autumn air was cold and clean and smelled of gorse and salt. He walked beside her, not too close, never too close, and answered her questions about the estate, the village, the history of the coastline. He spoke in short, measured sentences, as though each word cost him something, and she listened with the fierce attention of a woman for whom information had always been survival. She asked him about the navy. He told her not the heroic parts, those she already knew from the newspapers she had stolen from port towns, but the other parts, the boredom, the fear, the particular loneliness of command, the way the sea at night looked like the end of the world. "I thought I would die there," he said once, standing at the cliff edge with the wind whipping his coat. "I thought I would die at sea, and that would be the whole of it, and I would have been content with that." "What changed?" He looked at her. "Plymouth." She did not reply, but she did not step away. He asked her about the ships. She told him. Not the bearable parts, the navigation, the languages, the ports, but the other parts, the hunger, the cold, the nights when she lay in the hammock and listened to the rats and the bilge water and wondered whether anyone in the world would notice if she simply ceased to exist. "No one would have," she said. She was not asking for pity. She was stating a fact. "I was not registered anywhere. I had no parish, no school, no record. If that ship had gone down with all hands, there would have been no evidence I had ever lived." Wolfe stopped walking. He turned to face her. The wind was fierce, and his hair was in his eyes, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Raw, furious, aching. "There was evidence," he said, "in my study, on my desk, in every letter Birch sent, in every port manifest, in the fact that for 4 years the first thought I had every morning was whether you were alive." The air between them was charged, electric. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. "That is the non-alarming answer," she said. "That is the truest one. And then, and this is important, so please listen closely." She reached out and touched his hand, not the other way around. He had not touched her since the night he found her on the cliff. He had been scrupulous about that, never standing too close, never reaching for her, never presuming that his desire gave him the right to her body. She touched him. Her fingers found his. They were cold. Both of them, from the wind, and the contact was small and specific and devastating. His breath caught. She heard it, and she watched the iron control in his face crack. Not break, not shatter, but crack, like frost on glass when the sun touches it. And in that crack she saw everything he had been holding back for 4 years. They stood like that, on the cliff edge, with the sea crashing below and the wind howling above, and their hands touching. And neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved, and the moment stretched and stretched and stretched until it contained everything. His thumb moved. Just once. A slow, deliberate stroke across the back of her hand, tracing the line of her knuckle. The touch was so small and so specific that it stopped her breath. She felt it everywhere, in her station, in her pulse, in her ribs, in the base of her throat where her heartbeat had migrated and was hammering against her skin as though trying to escape. She looked up at him. The wind had pushed his dark hair across his forehead, and his grey eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that was almost painful to receive. He was looking at her the way a man looks at the horizon after years at sea, as though she were not just beautiful, but necessary, as though she were the fixed point by which he navigated. His free hand came up, slowly. He touched a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her cheek as he moved it, gently, so gently, behind her ear. His fingertips grazed her temple, the place where the stitches had been. He traced the thin line of the scar, and his jaw tightened, and she understood that he was touching the evidence of what she had survived to reach him. His face was very close. She could smell cedar and salt. She could feel the warmth of his breath. His lips were a fraction from hers, close enough that the next word either of them spoke would close the distance. "Delphine," he said. Her name in his mouth was a sound she wanted to live inside. Then Mrs. Pell's voice rang out from the terrace, sharp, practical, utterly devastating in its timing, that dinner was ready and the soup was getting cold, and she had not spent 2 hours over a stock pot to serve it tepid. They separated, not quickly. There was nothing guilty in the movement, but with the slow, reluctant awareness of 2 people being pulled out of a dream by the daylight. They walked back together in silence. They ate dinner in silence. They parted at the foot of the stairs in silence, and Delphine lay in her feather bed and pressed her hand, the hand that had touched his, against her chest, and felt her heart beating so hard she thought her ribs might break again. Captain Absalom Marchetti arrived at Kenmore Hall on the 17th day. Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking he would not dare. A broken-legged merchant captain with nothing but debts and fury walking into the house of a duke? Keep listening, because what happened next would change everything. And not in the way anyone expected. He came by carriage. His leg was splintered and he could not ride. With 2 of his surviving crew members and a solicitor he had hired in the village with money he did not have. He arrived at noon. He demanded entry. He demanded his daughter. The butler informed him that the Duke of Kenmore was not receiving callers. Marchetti began to shout. Now I should tell you, and this is the kind of historical detail that matters, that what Captain Marchetti was doing was in purely legal terms not unreasonable. Delphine was his daughter. She were unmarried. Under the law he had a right to her custody. He could, if he chose, petition a magistrate to compel her return. He could, if he were very stupid, attempt to force his way into the house. He was very stupid. He pushed past the butler. He limped into the entrance hall. He raised his voice and called Delphine's name. "In mai stesso che in puoi una fin droissai." The name he had not spoken with affection in 21 years, the name he now used like a summons, like a command, like a rope thrown around an escaping animal. And then the Duke of Kenmore appeared at the top of the stairs. He came down slowly. He was in no hurry. He was wearing riding clothes, dark coat, tall boots, no cravat. His hands were at his sides. His face was perfectly, terribly calm. "Captain Marchetti," he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everyone in the room stop breathing. "You are in my house without invitation. I want my daughter. I am aware of what you want. She is mine. By law, you have no right." "I have every right." Wolf reached the bottom of the stairs. He stood 2 feet from Marchetti, and the difference between them was the difference between a cliff face and a dinghy. "I have the right of a peer of the realm to protect a person on his property from harm. I have the right of a magistrate, which I am, for this district, to investigate reports of violent treatment. And I have the right of a man who has seen what you did to your daughter's wrists and has decided that you will never touch her again." Marchetti's face went white, then red. "You cannot keep her. She is not your wife. She is not your ward. She is not your anything." The Duke's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "She is a grown woman who has chosen, freely, to remain in this house. If you wish to challenge that choice, you may petition the courts. I will be delighted to present the courts with the evidence my investigator has compiled over the last 4 years. The debts, the unpaid wages, the assault on the customs officer in Falmouth, the cargo fraud in Lisbon, and the testimony of every crew member who has watched you beat your daughter since she was old enough to walk." Silence. Absolute, ringing, devastating silence. "You will leave now," Wolf said. "If you return to this estate, you will be arrested for trespassing. If you attempt to contact Delphine by any means, I will destroy you. Not socially. I have no interest in society. Financially, completely. I will buy your debts. I will call them in. I will see you in a debtor's prison before Christmas. Do you understand?" Marchetti stood in the entrance hall of Kenmore, surrounded by marble and candlelight and the weight of 7 centuries of aristocratic power, and he understood. He understood the way a small boat understands a storm, utterly, helplessly, with a certain knowledge that resistance was not merely futile, but suicidal. He left, but he did not disappear quietly. For 3 days, Marchetti lingered in the village, drinking at the inn, telling anyone who would listen that the Duke of Kenmore had stolen his daughter, and that he would have justice. He hired a second solicitor. He wrote a letter to the magistrate in Exeter. Wolf did not wait. On the morning of the 4th day, Birch arrived at the village inn with a leather satchel containing 14 documents. The first was a writ of seizure against the wreck of the Gloriana, which, as it had broken apart on the Duke's shoreline, was now legally salvage belonging to the Kenmore estate. The 2nd through 8th were letters of demand from 7 Bristol merchants to whom Marchetti owed a combined total of £462. Debts the Duke had purchased overnight through his solicitor at a discount of 30 pence on the pound. The 9th was a sworn statement from the customs officer in Falmouth, whom Marchetti had struck. The 10th through 13th were affidavits from former crew members documenting violence aboard the Gloriana. The 14th was a letter from Wolfe himself, written in that precise, small handwriting, which read, "Captain Marchetti, you now owe me £462. I am calling the debt in full. If it is not paid within 7 days, I will file for your committal to the Exeter debtors' prison. If you leave England within 48 hours and never return, I will forgive the debt. Choose." Marchetti chose. He took passage on a coal brig bound for Lisbon the following morning. He did not say goodbye to his daughter. He did not ask to see her. He simply left, the way he had always left everything, without looking back, without apology, without love. He did not come back. Delphine had listened to the entire exchange from the landing above. She had heard every word. She had watched through the balustrade as Wolf, quiet, controlled, devastating Wolf, had dismantled her father with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a winter sea. She was shaking, not with fear, with something far more complicated and far more dangerous. When Wolf climbed the stairs, she was waiting for him. "You should not have listened to that," he said. "You should not have done it." He stopped. "You did not want him sent away." "I wanted to do it myself." Her voice was fierce. Fiercer than she had intended, rawer than she had expected. 21 years of silence and obedience and flinching at footsteps, and what she felt now was not gratitude but fury. Not at him. At the fact that someone else had had to fight her battle because the law would not let her fight it herself. Wolf looked at her, and then he did something she had never seen him do. He stepped aside. "Then go," he said. "He is still in the drive. Go and say what you need to say." She stared at him. "I will not speak for you unless you ask me to," he said. "I will not fight your battles unless you want me to. But I will burn down every barrier between you and the things you deserve. That is what I can offer you. Take it or leave it." Delphine went. She walked out the front door of Kenmore Hall and down the gravel drive in the blue wool dress with the pearl buttons, with her dark hair loose in the wind and her broken ribs aching, and her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and she reached the carriage before it had pulled away. "Father." Marchetti turned. His face was grey with pain and something worse, the dawning recognition that the balance of power had shifted and would never shift back. "I am not coming with you," Delphine said. "Not now, not ever. You gave me nothing, no name, no record, no education, no kindness, no love. You fed me scraps and housed me in the hold and hit me when you were drunk and ignored me when you were sober. You treated me like ballast, like cargo, like something you owned but did not want." Her voice did not shake. Her voice was steady and clear and as strong as the sea that had nearly killed her. "I forgive you," she said. "Not for your sake, for mine. Because I will not carry you any further. But I will never see you again, and if you come near me, I will let him destroy you, and I will watch." She turned. She walked back to the house. She did not look back, and Wolf Sterndale, Duke of Kenmore, was standing in the doorway, and his eyes were bright, and his hands were shaking, and when she reached him, he said, very quietly, "That was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed. It was the easiest thing I have ever done," she said, "because I finally had somewhere to stand." What happened next between them was not sudden. It was not a capitulation or a collapse. It was instead something far more rare and far more valuable, a construction. Two people building something between them, brick by careful brick, with honesty for mortar. Now, I need to tell you something about what marriage meant for a woman in 1843. Under the laws of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a separate legal entity. Her property became her husband's. Her earnings became his earnings. Her body, her children, her very name. All of it was absorbed into his identity. For most women, this was simply the way of the world. But for Delphine, a woman who had spent her entire life being owned by one man, the prospect of signing herself over to another, no matter how kind, was not romance. It was a second surrender, and she needed to be certain it was not. She told him she would not be his mistress. He told her he had never wanted a mistress. She told him she did not know how to be a duchess. He told her he did not know how to be a duke. She told him she could not promise to love him. Not yet, not when love was a word that had never been spoken to her without conditions attached. He told her he had already loved her for 4 years and could wait 4 more, or 40, or forever. That is absurd, she said. Yes, he agreed. You do not even know me. I know that you survived 21 years with a man who tried to erase you, and you are still here. I know that you navigate by the stars. I know that you read stolen books in a cargo hold by lamplight. I know that you laughed. You laughed on the first day you woke in this house, and it was the most extraordinary sound I had ever heard. You are romanticizing me. I am describing you. They were in the library. It was evening. The fire was low. The wind outside had dropped for the first time in days, and the silence was deep and warm and intimate. She looked at him. He looked at her, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. What happened next is one of my favorite moments in this entire story. And if you think you know where it is going, I promise you, you do not. I want to show you something, she said. She reached into the pocket of her dress, the blue wool dress, the dress he had chosen for her, the dress that was the first garment she had ever worn that was not mended or borrowed or stolen. And she pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old. The edges were soft with handling. The ink had faded. I stole this from a bookseller's stall in Genoa when I was 14, she said. It is a page from a volume of Italian verse. My mother's language. I have carried it in every dress I have ever owned. She held it out to him. He took it. He unfolded it. He read it. His Italian was serviceable, learned in the Navy, and his face changed, not dramatically. But the frost cracked a little further, and the grey eyes warmed, and when he looked up at her, she saw something in his expression that she had never seen in any man's face before. Reverence, not for the poem, for her. Delphine, he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name. The sound of it in his voice, low, careful, tender, as though the syllables were something fragile he was holding in his hands, was unlike anything she had ever heard. Yes? I would very much like to kiss you, but only if you want me to. She did not answer with words. She stepped forward, 1 step, closing the distance she had opened weeks ago, and she put her hands on his chest, and she felt his heart hammering beneath her palms, and she thought, this man who commands rooms and destroys villains and has not smiled in 4 years is trembling because he asked to kiss me. Yes, she said. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had waited 4 years for permission, and now, having received it, could not hold back a moment longer. His hands came up to her face, both hands, cup in her jaw, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, and he kissed her the way the sea met the shore, completely, overwhelmingly, without reservation. And Delphine, who had never been kissed, who had never been held, who had never been wanted, kissed him back. She kissed him with everything she had, with 21 years of loneliness, with the salt of the sea still in her blood, with the stolen poem in his hands and the fire at their backs, and the enormous, impossible, undeniable fact that she had been found. When they separated, they were both... Breathing hard. "I have a confession," Wolf said. "Another one. There is a room in the East Wing." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Pell told me." Of course, Mrs. Pell had told her. Mrs. Pell missed nothing. "Are you angry?" he asked. "I was, when she described it. The charts, the manifests, the miniature. It frightened me. It sounded like something a man would do who wanted to own a person, not love one. And now?" She looked at him. This man who had searched for her across 4 years and the width of the English Channel, who had faced down her father without raising his voice, who had stepped aside so she could fight her own battle, who had asked before he kissed her. "Now, I think it is the room of a man who had no idea what to do with what he felt," she said, "and who did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to be thorough." He almost smiled. Almost. A little more this time. The frost was melting. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Ask me in a month." "Will the answer be yes?" "Ask me in a month." She made him wait 5 weeks, because she was Delphine Marchetti, and she had never done anything on someone else's schedule, and because she wanted to be certain, not of him, but of herself. She wanted to be certain that she was choosing him, not escape, that she was walking toward something, not away from something. That the woman who said yes at the altar was not a woman fleeing a cargo hold, but a woman standing on solid ground for the first time in her life. During these 5 weeks, she explored Kenmore Hall. She read every book in the library she could reach. She walked every path on the estate. She befriended the village doctor's wife, a woman named Mrs. Gould, who had a kind face and a sharp mind, and who taught Delphine how to make tea properly, which was something she had never learned aboard a ship where the kettle was shared among 14 men and boiled until the water tasted of rust. She learned to ride, badly at first, and then with increasing confidence, because she had spent her life balancing on a moving deck, and a horse, she discovered, was simply a deck that breathed. And she discovered something else about Kenmore Hall, something Wolfe had not mentioned, and which Mrs. Pell revealed one afternoon with the particular satisfaction of a woman sharing a truth that had been kept too long. The East Wing room, the one with the charts and the manifests, was not the only room Wolfe had prepared. There was another room, on the 2nd floor, with tall windows facing the sea. It had been furnished with a writing desk, a bookcase stocked with volumes of Italian poetry and English novels and navigation manuals. There was a globe in the corner. There was a Persian rug on the floor, deep red, thick enough to lose one's toes in. There was a window seat built into the bay with cushions covered in blue velvet, the exact colour of the dress he had given her. "When did he commission this?" Delphine asked. 2 years ago, Mrs. Pell said. "Before the storm, before the wreck. Before he had any reason to believe you would ever set foot in this house." Delphine stood in the doorway of that room, a room built for a woman who did not know it existed by a man who could not be certain she ever would. And she pressed her hand against the door frame and breathed. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because this is important. This is not just a romantic gesture. This is evidence of something deeper and more complicated. A man building a life for someone who had no life, constructing a home for someone who had no home, before he had any guarantee of anything except his own devotion. You could call it obsessive. You can call it beautiful. I think it is both. And I think the tension between those two things is what makes this story worth telling. It was during the third week that Collis Fane came to call. The first mate had recovered from his injuries. A dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, lacerations that had healed into pale lines across his weathered face, and had been lodging at the village inn, while the Duke's solicitor arranged compensation for the crew. He came to Kenmore Hall on a Thursday afternoon, and Mrs. Pell showed him to the drawing room, and Delphine came down to see him because he was the only person from her old life who had ever shown her anything resembling decency. They sat across from each other in the drawing room. Tea was served. "You look well, Miss Marchetti," he said. "I am well, Mr. Fane." He nodded. He was not a man of many words. Sailors rarely were, but the words he chose carried weight. "Your father is still in the village," he said. "His leg is mending. He has been asking after you." Something cold moved through her chest. "I know. I came because I wanted you to hear something from me before he tries anything." Fane leaned forward. "The crew. Every one of us knew what he did to you. Every one of us saw. And not a single one of us did a damned thing about it." His voice was rough. "I positioned myself between you and him 3 times in 9 years, and I thought that was enough." He shook his head. "It was cowardice." "You gave me more than anyone else did," she said. 3 times is 3 more than 0, and you are here now. That matters." Fane reached across the tea table and placed his hand over hers. Not romantic, not a proposition. The gesture of a man who had failed a child and wanted, too late, to acknowledge it. His hand was rough and warm, and Delphine let it rest there, because kindness from men was still so new to her that every instance of it felt like something worth holding. Neither of them heard the footsteps in the corridor. Wolf appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene, Fane's hand over Delphine's, their heads inclined toward each other, the intimacy of the posture, and his expression did not change. That was how Delphine knew he was furious, because Wolf Sterndale's anger did not look like anger. It looked like stillness. It looked like silence. It looked like the surface of the sea before a storm. Perfectly flat, perfectly calm, and absolutely deadly. "Mr. Fane," he said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were murderous. Fane withdrew his hand. He stood. He was not a small man, but beside the Duke he looked diminished. Not physically, but in some other way. Some essential way that had to do with the difference between a man who had watched injustice and a man who had spent 4 years trying to end it. "Your Grace, I came to give Miss Marchetti news of her father's departure." "I see. And to apologize for years of insufficient action." "I see." Wolf entered the room. He did not sit. He stood behind the chair where Delphine had been sitting, and his hand rested on the back of it. And the gesture was not threatening, but it was territorial. A silent, unmistakable statement of position. The apology is appreciated, Wolf said. The hand-holding less so. Wolf, Delphine said, not your grace. Not Duke. She used his name, and the sound of it, sharp, deliberate, a command disguised as an address, stopped him mid-sentence. Mr. Fane is apologizing for 9 years of watching my father beat me, she said. If you would like to be jealous, you may do so later, in private, where it will be less embarrassing for all three of us. Fane looked at the floor. His mouth twitched. Wolf looked at Delphine. His jaw worked. And then, for only the second time since she had known him, he almost smiled. Very well, he said. Later. Fane left shortly afterward. At the door, he turned to Delphine and said, He is a good man. I know. A terrifying one. I know that too. The jealousy did not wait for later. It arrived that evening in the library when Wolf was pretending to read a volume of naval history and Delphine was pretending not to notice that he had not turned a page in 20 minutes. You are being ridiculous, she said. I am reading. You are sulking. You have been on the same page for the length of time it would take to sail from here to Plymouth. He set the book down. He touched your hand. He was apologizing. He was touching your hand. And if he had been proposing marriage, which he was not, it would still be my hand, not yours. Wolf looked at her. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the sea threw itself against the cliffs with its usual indifferent violence. You are right, he said, and the admission cost him something. She could see it, the way the words dragged across his pride like a hull across rocks. I have no claim on you. You have not accepted me, and even if you had, a claim is not it is not possession. I know that. Do you? I'm learning. He paused. I am not a man. Who has ever had to share? I have lived alone for 4 years. Before that, I lived on a ship where everything was mine or no one's. I have no practice in... He searched for the word. In trusting that something given freely cannot be taken. Delphine set down her own book. She crossed the room. She stood in front of his chair and looked down at him, this enormous, powerful, terrified man, and she put her hand on his cheek. Collis Fane is a decent man who failed me for 9 years and knows it, she said. You are a stubborn man who searched for me for 4 years and found me. These are not the same thing. And if you cannot tell the difference, then you do not deserve the thing you are afraid of losing. He turned his face into her palm. His eyes closed. His breath was warm against her wrist. I can tell the difference, he said. I simply do not enjoy other men touching you. Then you will have to endure it, because I have spent my entire life being told that no man would want to touch me, and I refuse to feel guilty that one finally did. He opened his eyes, grey, steady, burning. No, he said, not one. Every man in that room wanted to touch you. I was the only one watching closely enough to be honest about it. And despite herself, despite the anger and the independence and the 21 years of learning not to need anyone, she felt her breath catch. Because that was the thing about Wolf Sterndale. He was possessive and jealous and alarming and absolutely, devastatingly honest. He did not pretend. He did not perform. He simply said what he saw, and what he saw was her, and what he felt about what he saw was everything. I'm going to bed, she said. Good night. Good night. She made it to the door before she turned back. For the record, she said, I did not enjoy him touching my hand either. It reminded me of being helped. Your touch reminds me of something else entirely." She left before he could respond, but she heard very faintly, from behind the closed door, a sound she had never heard before. Wolf Sterndale laughed. The separation came in the 4th week. And this is the part of the story that nearly broke me to write. Because what came next was not a villain with fists. It was something worse, something quieter, something that came dressed in silk and spoke in the accent of old money. It came not from a misunderstanding or a quarrel, but from something worse. From Wolf's aunt, Lady Floris Sterndale, who descended upon Kenmore Hall like a well-dressed plague. Now, let me explain something about the aristocratic family structure in this period. When a duke was unmarried, his closest female relative, typically his mother or aunt, held unofficial authority over social matters. Lady Florrie had been trying to manage Wolf's life for 4 years from a distance. She had sent letters. She had sent messengers. She had, on one memorable occasion, sent a vicar. None of it had worked. But the news that her nephew was housing an unmarried woman, the daughter of a merchant captain no less, with no family, no fortune, no connections, and no chaperone, had accomplished what 4 years of pleading could not. Lady Florrie arrived. She was 60, silver-haired, sharp-boned, and possessed of the particular brand of aristocratic confidence that mistakes cruelty for candour. She took one look at Delphine and said, "I see." That was all. 2 words. But the way she said them, the way her gaze travelled from Delphine's hair to her boots, the way her lip thinned, the way she turned back to Wolf, as though Delphine had already been assessed and dismissed, communicated everything. This is the woman. This is what 4 years of seclusion produced. This merchant's daughter, this nobody. "Aunt Floris," Wolf said. His voice was ice. "You cannot possibly intend to marry this girl." "I can, and I do. She has no connections, no fortune, no family worth acknowledging. The Ton will never accept her. You will be a laughingstock. The Sterndale name belongs to me, not to society, not to you." "Wolf, you will address her as Miss Marchetti, or you will leave." Lady Floris turned to Delphine. And what she said next, what she said with that precise, polished, devastating upper-class diction, was calculated to wound. "My dear girl, I am sure you are very grateful for his hospitality, but you must understand, also ciu omantaigi gomas bentimst. A duke does not marry a woman he rescues. He provides for her. He finds her a situation, a teaching position perhaps, a cottage somewhere. But marriage?" She smiled. The smile was like a blade wrapped in silk. "That would be charitable to the point of absurdity." The room went silent. Delphine felt the words land. She felt them the way she had felt her father's hand, sharp, specific, designed to reduce her. And for one terrible moment, she believed them. Not because Lady Floris was right, but because 21 years of being told she was nothing had built a voice inside her that sounded exactly like this woman, and that voice said, "She is right. You are nothing. You are cargo. You are a rescued thing, not a chosen one." She stood. She looked at Wolf. She saw the fury building in him, saw the muscles in his jaw flex, saw his hands curl at his sides. And she knew that if she stayed, he would destroy his aunt for her. He would burn down his last family relationship. He would choose her over everything, and she could not let him do that, not yet. Not until she was certain that her presence was a gift and not a debt. "Your Grace," she said, "I believe I shall take some air." Delphine, please." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. "Let me go." She walked out of the drawing room and up the stairs and into the room he had built for her. The room with the blue cushions and the Italian poetry and the globe. Vela and she closed the door and sat on the window seat and looked at the sea and let herself, for the first time in weeks, feel the full weight of what she was. A woman without a name, without a family, without a parish or a record or a single document proving she existed. A woman who had been raised in a cargo hold and dressed in rags and beaten when the wind was wrong. A woman who, by every metric society used to measure worth, was worth nothing. And she thought, is this what love looks like? Or is this what rescue looks like? And can I tell the difference? She stayed in that room for 2 days. Wolfe did not come to her door. He sent Mrs. Pell with meals. He sent books. He sent a note, a single line in his precise, small handwriting. "I will wait." Lady Floris left on the second morning. Delphine heard the carriage on the gravel from her window. She did not watch it go, but she heard 10 minutes after the carriage departed a knock on her door. Not Wolfe. Birch. His. "Grace asked me to give you this," Birch said. He held out a folded letter. Delphine opened it. "My aunt is wrong. She is wrong about everything she said and everything she implied and everything her silence communicated. But I cannot make you believe that. Only you can decide what you are worth, and I will not insult you by deciding for you. I will tell you only this. I did not rescue you. The sea put you on my shore. You rescued yourself when you climbed that cliff. Everything since then, everything has been your choice, including staying, including leaving, if that is what you need. I am in the study. The door is open. W." She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket next to the stolen page of Italian verse. Then she washed her face and braided her hair and walked downstairs and into the study where the door was, as promised, open. He was at his desk. He looked up. He looked exhausted. Grey beneath the eyes. Shadows that had not been there 2 days ago. He had not slept. She could see it. "Your aunt called me a charity case," she said. "My aunt is a fool." She is not entirely wrong. She is entirely wrong. I have nothing to bring to this marriage. No dowry, no connections, no family. I do not even have a baptismal record, Wolfe. I am legally no one. He stood. He came around the desk. He stood before her, and he did not touch her. And the restraint of that, the way he held himself perfectly still, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, was more eloquent than any declaration. "You bring yourself," he said. "You bring the mind that navigates by stars. You bring the courage that climbed a cliff in a storm. You bring the Italian your mother taught you and the English your father tried to take from you. You bring a laugh that I heard once and have not been able to forget." His voice dropped. "You bring the only thing I have ever wanted, which is someone who looks at me and does not see a title or a fortune or a problem to be managed. Someone who sees me. That is not a dowry. It is worth more than any dowry I have ever been offered, and I have been offered several." She looked at him. He looked at her, and the distance between them, the distance she had created, the distance his aunt had tried to make permanent, collapsed. I have to pause here and tell you. This next moment is why I love writing these stories. Not the grand gestures, not the revenge, The quiet instant when two people who have been circling each other finally stop. When the fear runs out, and the only thing left is the truth. That is what happened on the 35th day. She walked into his study and said, "Yes." He looked up from his desk. He looked at her. He set down his pen. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because you saved me, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you are the first person who has ever looked at me and seen me. Not what I lack, not what I survived, not what I can do for you, but me. And because I think I have been looking for you, too, without knowing it. Since Plymouth." Wolfe stood. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her, and she saw that his hands were shaking again, and she reached out and took them, and she held them steady. "I would like to burn the miniature," she said. "Why?" "Because it is not very good, and because you have the real thing now." This time he did smile. A real smile. Slow, rare, transformative. It changed his face entirely. It turned him from a cliff face into a harbour. And for this community, all of you, listening right now, wherever you are, I want you to hold on to that image. Because that smile, earned across 4 years and 5 weeks and a lifetime of loneliness, is what this story is about. Not the wreck, not the revenge, not the Duke's power, or the captain's cruelty, or the legal machinery of 1843 England. It is about two people who had been alone finding each other. And it is about the fact that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not climb a cliff or face down a villain or survive a storm. Sometimes the bravest thing is to stay. They married in the chapel at Kenmore Hall on a morning in December when the sea was calm and the sky was the colour of clean linen. The vicar came from the village. Mrs. Pell wept. Birch served as witness. Mr. Collis Fane, recovered and newly employed as harbour master at the Duke's private dock, stood at the back of the chapel and nodded once when the vows were spoken. There were no guests from London, no society, no family, not hers, not his. They did not need them, but society came anyway. It came 3 weeks later in the form of an invitation. Lady Florrie, Raya Fry, who had gone home and told every drawing-room in Devonshire that her nephew had lost his mind over a merchant's daughter, had inadvertently accomplished something she had not intended. She had made Delphine Marchetti the most talked-about woman in the county. Every landowner, every vicar's wife, every minor baronet within 40 miles wanted to see the woman who had wrecked on the rocks of Kenmore and captured the reclusive Duke. The invitation was from Sir Horace Cavell, the county's most prominent magistrate, for a Christmas ball at Cavell Park. Wolfe looked at the invitation as though it were an insect. "No," he said. "Yes," Delphine said. "I have not attended a social function in 4 years." "Then you are overdue." "I despise them." "I have never attended one in my life. You have at least had the luxury of being able to despise something you have experienced. I have never danced at a ball. I have never worn a gown that was not made of sailcloth or mended cotton. I have never walked into a room where people looked at me and saw a duchess." She met his eyes. "I want to walk into a room with you. I want them to see me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down the invitation. "Very well," he said, "but I will not dance with anyone except you. You will not have to. Now, there is something you must understand about what happened at Cavell Park on the night of the 23rd of December, 1843. when the Duke and Duchess of Kenmore arrived. It was the first time in 4 years that Wolfe Sterndale had been seen in public. The room of 150 guests went so silent that you could hear the candle wax dripping. And Delphine, who had been cargo, who had been beaten, who had been locked in a hold, who had been called a charity case by a woman with silver hair and a smile like a blade, walked into that silence wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that Wolfe had ordered from London without telling her, with her dark hair swept up and her mother's amber eyes catching the candlelight. And she did not flinch. Lady Florrie was there. Of course she was there. She was standing near the punch bowl with a cluster of women who had been discussing the Kenmore scandal in hushed, delicious tones. Delphine walked straight to her. "Lady Florrie," she said, "how lovely to see you again." Floris's face was remarkable. It cycled through surprise, outrage, calculation, and, finally, reluctantly, surrender, because Delphine was not a merchant's daughter standing in a drawing room begging for acceptance. She was the Duchess of Kenmore. She outranked every woman in the room. And she was smiling, not with warmth, not with spite, but with the calm, measured confidence of a woman who had climbed a cliff in a storm and survived. "Your Grace," Floris said. The words came out like they had been extracted by forceps. "I wanted to thank you," Delphine said, "for your visit last month. It was clarifying." And she turned away, and Wolfe was beside her, and his hand was on the small of her back, and the room was watching, and for the first time in her life, Delphine. Marchetti, Delphine Sterndale, Duchess of Kenmore, was seen, not as cargo, not as a victim, not as a charity case or a rescued thing or a curiosity to be whispered about, as herself. They danced. One dance, a waltz, because Wolfe had taught her in the library over 3 evenings, counting under his breath, stepping on her feet only twice. They danced, and the room watched, and it did not matter whether they approved or disapproved, because the woman in the midnight blue silk and the man in the black coat were not dancing for them. They were dancing for themselves, for the 3 minutes on a Plymouth dock, for the 4 years of searching, for the storm and the cliff and the open door. Can I just say, this scene is why I do this. 2 people who had spent their whole lives alone, dancing together in front of 150 strangers and not caring about a single one of them. That is what I love about these stories. Not just the romance, the arrival, the moment. When someone who was invisible becomes undeniable. After the ceremony, they walked to the cliff edge. The wind was cold, but the sun was out for once, and the sea below was grey-green and restless and beautiful. "I have one more confession," Wolfe said. "How many confessions does one man need?" "This is the last one." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather notebook. It was worn at the edges. The pages were filled with precise, small handwriting. "This is every observation Birch made about the Gloriana over 4 years," he said. "Every port, every cargo, every detail about your movements. I kept it in my desk drawer. I opened it every morning. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to have it. Not to keep, to burn, if you like. But I want you to see it first. I want you to understand the scale of what I was doing, because you were right that first day. It was alarming. It was obsessive. And I will not pretend otherwise." She took the notebook, She opened it. She read the first entry: Plymouth Harbour, 14th June, 1839. Girl observed on deck of merchant vessel Gloriana. Dark hair, amber eyes, bruise on left cheekbone, approximately 17 years of age. She did not look away from me. She read the last entry. Gloriana reported departing Lisbon 28th September, 1843. Expected course, Channel passage to Bristol. Estimated arrival. Devon coast, mid-October. Mid-October. The storm had been the 14th of October. You knew she was coming, Delphine said. You knew the ship would pass your coastline. Yes. Is that why you were at the window that night? I have been at that window every night the Gloriana has been at sea in British waters, every night for 2 years. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the sea. She looked at him. I will not burn this, she said. Why not? Because it is evidence, not of obsession, of faith. You believed I existed before you had any proof. You looked for me when no one else would have bothered. You waited. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. No one has ever waited for me before. Wolfe looked at the sea. Then he looked at his wife. His wife. The word was still extraordinary, still impossible, still the most real thing in his vocabulary. And he said very quietly, I would have waited forever. And Delphine, Duchess of Kenmore, who had been cargo and captive and invisible and nothing, stood on the edge of England with the wind in her hair and the notebook against her heart and the man who had found her standing beside her. And she believed him, because he had already proved it. I am already working on the next story, and let me tell you, it might be even more intense than this one. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. I will see you soon.